And welcome back, everyone, to Mimetic Theory 101. This is our second video, but we're going to be going over what's typically called the first move of mimetic desire, or the first principle of mimetic theory, which is mimetic desire. So Wolfgang, thank you for coming back and talking with us about these topics. Mimetic theory claims to offer a corrective to the popular understanding of desire and how desire functions. I was wondering if you could start off this conversation with describing maybe what the popular version of desire is and how mimetic theory corrects that understanding.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. The usual common everyday understanding of desire is that we or that a subject has a inner longing, and out of him or herself, the subject desires a certain object because of his autonomous will, because of his autonomous desire. But this is not really true if we take a closer look. And the most important thing to understand is that after we have satisfied our primary desires, which are not desires in that sense at all, maybe let's call them primary needs. So after we have fulfilled our primary needs, there is a longing in us which is not automatically oriented and directed. So most of the time we desire what others desire. We desire what people who we think are cool people, who we see as models, people whom we adore. What they desire becomes also our desire. So mimetic desire discovers that in the most important way, human desire is mimetic desire, meaning imitative desire, or borrowed desire. And sometimes I teach a lot, I taught and still teach courses on mimetic theory, especially grown-up people in the academia and so on. They resist that insight because they believe, of course, they themselves are completely autonomous. And they have questions about, is this a proper, profound anthropology? And I always say, look at the money what today in our world is invested in advertisement business, in fashion business. So the people who make money with anthropology indirectly, they understand what borrowed desire is, because most of the advertisement functions according to that cool people that are attractive, people that are adored. They show us products in order that we imitate their desire and become as powerful people and attractive people as they are. And we can observe that all the time in our own lives, just looking at advertisements.
Yeah, I mean, in the era of such political polarization, especially where I live in the United States, it's becoming more and more clear to me how we can start mimicking those that we think of our enemies too. Right? So as much as I don't like certain politicians, I can easily start mimicking the very thing that I detest about them in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
So this
I
is,
mean, there's also a deeper philosophical and even theological thesis connected to that. I discovered that later by coming across a reference to Plato, and then later on by reading Augustine's book, The City of God. And Augustine took it from Plato, and the thesis is we cannot not imitate what we adore. So human beings imitate what they adore. And this is a very powerful insight. And I think it's profoundly true that we imitate what we adore. And therefore, it's so important what we adore,
Yes.
because what we adore, we will imitate. And so the choice of the models that are important for our life is really important. So this Platonic insight, human beings imitate what they adore,
Mm.
is profound. According to Augustine, it's in a nutshell the most important insight of a theory of religion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you see how deeply mimetic theory is also connected to these philosophical, theological insights.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. What role, we've talked about a little bit about envy in the introduction, but what role does envy play for mimetic theory? It's often, there's a new book out called Rene Girard, The Prophet of Envy. And it's kind of a series of his interviews with folks. So it's almost as if mimetic theory could be a theory of envy. That's how important envy is to the theory. So could you talk about desire and envy a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important topic, and I mean this is one of the emotions or the vices in our life that we all know and feel and have to deal with and have to learn how to cope with envy. I mean, Shiraz' only book that he wrote in English is his book on Shakespeare, which has the title A Theatre of Envy. So envy is really an emotion or a vice that you can explain with the help of mimetic theory in a very plausible and very profound way. But we also have to be careful. Uh, Mimetic theory is much more than just a theory of envy, because there's the other danger to see human beings as nothing but envious creatures.
Mm.
And this would be, again, a one-sided take on mimetic theory. So envy is one of the most important possibilities and outcomes of mimetic desire, but it's not by default, it's not necessary. So it's one version, very often, very nasty, very often, not not a nice emotion, but it's just a description of the feeling that we see someone has an object, someone we adore has an object, and we want to have the same object. And if we cannot share it or cannot have the same, we easily develop envious feelings. And but this is just one version. So mimetic theory is just broader than nothing but envy. But envy is, of course, a very important thing. And I mean, a lot of advertisements and a lot of the driving force of consumerism and all we let the economy go is envy driven in some way, in a broader sense.
Mm. What is the other alternative to envy? So it doesn't, mimetic theory doesn't have to lead to envy. Is there a more positive thing that mimetic theory could lead us towards?
In the tradition, and that was when I was writing my book, I became very fascinated in the traditional, so in the traditional philosophy, in Augustine, in St. Thomas. So until the 17th century, you have the very important distinction between emulation and envy.
Mm.
Emulation is something, for instance, the church fathers and the people responsible for a monastery or a cloister, they were always discussing, and they knew, of course, envy is very destructive. It's nothing worse than you have envious people in a monastery. But should you have emulation? Should you have mimetic encouragement? Should you have people who by mimetic desire get going, get in a positive sense competitive, get out of their beds to work and write and do something. Then all the people who thought in earlier times, is this a good thing? They said, yes, it's a good thing. If children in school are emulating each other, they become better students. So one of the problems we just discovered during the COVID-19 pandemic is that when all the students and people have to stay at home, this positive emulation, this catching fire by the other is lacking. It's much more difficult. It's difficult to get it over video conferences or phone calls and so on, to catch the fire and to move forward. So this distinction between emulation and envy is a key distinction for hundreds of years of our tradition. And in some way it breaks down in the 17th century. So if you study the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, he is a philosopher who goes back to Aristotle and discovers and discusses Aristotle's and the traditional distinction between emulation and envy. But for Hobbes, it's no longer possible to distinguish these two emotions, these two feelings. So for him, it's the same, because the preconditions of these distinctions got weakened dramatically. And one of the preconditions is that emulation is in some way connected to longing for eternal goods who do not divide us so easily. I mean, for me, this was because I'm not a professor. Maybe indirectly I am, but but my university does not pay me to be a leading Girardian.
Yes.
So that's not the main, because in today's academia, it's also a problem, of course. You have to subscribe to a discipline. So my discipline is Catholic social teaching, and you can ask teachers of this discipline all over the world, and there will be 90% who have never heard about Girard. So it's not essential in some way. But for me, I mean, I was studying Girard and was very eager to get to know mimetic theory more and more. But at the same time, I developed my training in the discipline and wanted to become a professor. And for a certain time, I thought, for a couple of years, I thought, these are two tracks. So I have the Girardian track and I have the track to become a professor in my field, and they do not go together. Oh, but wow. When I discovered this profound difference between envy and emulation, I suddenly understood that in all the encyclicals, papal encyclicals on social issues, you have as a foundation, as a basis, always the insight that we have to long for the eternal goods first. And if we do that, some of the social questions, social justice, economic equality, all those things can be easier handled. And if this orientation is not there, you are already caught up in the envious entanglements. So for me, that was very helpful. And then I also started to use mimetic theory in my basic course in Catholic social teaching, because in Catholic social teaching, you have many texts that are most of the time overlooked and not addressed today at all, because they think this is some kind of a pious topping of the cake and not necessary, not the real substance about the technical issues of social justice. But it's not true. I mean, this tradition always says God is the highest good and it should be in the center, the summum bonum, the highest good. And this outreach for the highest good is the precondition to distinguish between emulation, which is something good and inspires us and moves us forward, and envy that leads to destruction, to violence, and to very bad developments. And when I understood that finally, on one of the occasions, I was just calling René Girard on the phone, and I told him very excited excited in an excited way, this discovery. And he immediately referred me, and it's in the book, to a passage of Dante's Divine Comedy in Dante. Dante is, of course, part of this traditional older world that understood those things perfectly well. And he immediately referred me to a passage in Dante where this is perfectly described, that how envy is always driving the people into deadlocks and very difficult situation, and we have to look up for the higher goods in order to avoid those cul-de-sacs, those deadlocks.
This is so fascinating to me because oftentimes when I get into conversations with Girardians, the topic of justice is seen as necessarily rivalristic, necessarily negative, necessarily um, something that you want to avoid, because justice is just another term for revenge in a lot of this thought. But you have a different view of justice and of social justice. And I think that your connection to it with the higher good is really helpful for me as I'm thinking this through, because I do hear a lot of sometimes Girardians saying that justice is just just an outcome of the sacrificial elements, and we'll get more into that in the next episode. But could you say a little bit more about social justice and the higher good, and how to avoid justice just being another word for revenge?
I mean, there is one passage in the Sermon on the Mount, rather in the end, where you find the verse, "Seek the kingdom first, everything else will be given."
Mm.
And if you look at the social encyclicals of the Catholic popes from the later 19th century onwards until today, there is nearly not one encyclical where this verse is not quoted.
Mm.
So the question is this just a topping of the cake to make it more biased, to make it more religious, or is this substantially important? And I think it's substantially important, because it says, if your primary concern, if the most important things in your life is money or promotion or other worldly goods, you will absolutely and unavoidably run into rivalries and in very difficult situations, because you will create automatically scarcity, and there is no easy way out of that. And so this is a spiritual precondition, that you say, if all those worldly concerns are not at the center of your longing, then you can manage those things, because then it's a question of sharing. Then you can have some kind of, and this is important for those who are rich, and it's important for those who are poor, because if both do not try to detach in that sense from those worldly goods, there is no way out of class struggle and violence and all those competition. And we have to live that. We have to give examples for that in real life, and then the other things can be handled. If everything is focusing just on worldly goods, which are always divisive and scarce, there is no good way. So then there is just the struggle, and then you have the struggle of the more powerful will get the things, and those who are less powerful try to get as much power as possible to turn the thing around. But it's always this zero-sum game, which is a very dangerous thing in some way. And probably in our modern world, we solve this zero-sum game by exploiting nature and the environment in a very terrible way, leading to the climate change and the crisis we are confronted with now. But we have to go back and focus our main desires in a different way. And I don't know about the Protestant tradition, but when I teach Catholic students, we have this tradition that at one occasion in a mass, in the celebration of the Eucharist, the priest says, "Raise your hearts," sursum corde in Latin. And in the Catholic community, the people stand up and say, "We have it. We turned it to the Lord in some way." Is that also in the Protestant tradition the same?
We have things similar to that, yeah.
Yeah, and we stand up, and I think this is a weekly orientation in that sense. But this is not just some bias thing. This is anthropologically essential. So and I was just fascinated and struck when I saw this is really mentioned in all the encyclicals. But most of the teachers or those who interpret or teach those encyclicals or social justice no longer focus on those things because they do not understand the anthropological meaning of it.
Wow. Your conversation about external goods is really great and helpful, and reminds me of the difference between internal and external mediation that Gerard talks a lot about, and that's always been helpful for me to understand rivalry and how to avoid rivalry. And what's the difference between internal and external mediation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also important. I mean, rivalry, as I said already before, you can distinguish between emulation and envy, and emulation is something good and brings the best out of all of us. But mimetic desire has many different outcomes and many different types. And one key distinction that was introduced by Girard already in his first book is the distinction between internal and external mediation. And this is just a conceptualization of the closeness of the subject and the model. So if the subject and the model are very close to each other, the chance that imitation gets rivalrous and destructive and violent is much, much higher. So therefore, the key insight, and there was just a couple of years ago, the former chief rabbi Jonathan Sacks in Great Britain wrote a book on violence and religion, saying what we can learn from Girard is that the most important source of human violence is sibling rivalry. So rivalry between brothers or between sisters or siblings, because they are so close to each other. You know, if you have a brother who is about the same age as you are, you're living in the same space, you're living in the same stage of your own development. So the likelihood that you get caught up in aiming for the same things that cannot be shared is very strong. And I have a very good example, and this is proven by sophisticated social science literature. We know that in a big company, if the CEO of a big company earns 20, 30, 40 times more than you, who are probably on the third stage of a company, this is not a big trouble for us. But if we hear that the leader of a department who is on the same level as yourself gets $10 more as an annual salary, that drives us crazy. So this is an example. We compare, of course, with those who are closest to us most eagerly, and there is the most dangerous possibility of rivalry turning into an envious, destructive way. So sibling rivalry is an important insight, and it's also the insight your neighbor is more likely to become a rival than a person who lives continents away, or the further away you are, the less likelihood is that there will be conflicts and rivalry for the same goods that cannot be shared. And that can be external rivalry. You can have a model from history. So if you want to become a good writer as Goethe, you don't become a rival with Goethe himself because he's dead already for centuries. So this is external mediation. But if you want to be better as your brother, it's difficult to avoid that. And you can go again back to writers in ancient times who already wrote about sibling rivalry when they gave the recommendation, if your brother goes into medicine, go into horse trading, not into medicine. So try to do something different in order to avoid these problems that are so likely.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the important moves in this, in desire, understanding desire, is the scandal, or the scandalon. And Gerard, I think, talks about that quite a bit in Deceit, Desire in the novel. What is this scandal, and what does it have to do with desire?
Shira always refers to the literal translation of scandal, and it means stumbling block, a stumbling block. So if you get caught up into rivalry with some of your neighbors, with a close friend or a close collaborator, the scandal consists in that the imitation of your neighbor, of your collaborator, easily turns him into an adversary. He starts as a model, but as soon as you desire the same things and focus on things that cannot be shared or divided or whatever, then you are caught up, and the model who triggered your desire becomes the person who hinders you to get what you desire. So this is the stumbling block. So the model becomes a stumbling block, something again and again described in the New Testament, which has a deep anthropological understanding of things that easily happen to us human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting because you write in your book about this model obstacle relationship, and how when we get to this point, we often want to make ourselves look completely different than the other. But you write, what they miss, or what we miss when we're in this relationship, is that their need to differ only increases their identicalness as they become more exact mirror reflections of each other. And this is one of the things that's kind of counterintuitive about mimetic theory, is that we always want to make ourselves, or think of ourselves, as so much different from our rivals, or from those we call our enemies. But in that difference, we end up looking almost exactly the same. Could you say more about that? Because it's so, like, it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah, that's true. And most of the time, we explain conflicts and rivalries by referring to our differences. But we just have to step out and look at conflicts we are not involved in it ourselves, and look at conflicts between colleagues of us, and we see how they look alike, how easily the more they think they are different, they are actually becoming more and more alike. So this is also a very interesting and old phenomenon, that conflicts turn adversaries into enemy brothers, mirroring each other. And at the same time, the deep insight, the more there is a lack of difference between us. As I explained already with the reference to sibling rivalry, the more likely it is that we become entangled in rivalries. So the lack of differences is one of the most important sources for rivalries. And as soon as we are caught up in rivalries, that makes us even more, turns us even more into mirrors of each other. So probably violence and rivalry, as soon as they escalate, they are very imitative. I think one of the understandings, if you study violence, human violence, a little bit closer, you will realize there is nothing so contagious as violence. And contagion means also this making the people all going in the same direction. And this is can easily lead to a cycle of violence, a dangerous cycle of violence, an escalation to extremes, as Schrar pointed it out in his last book.
And the answer to that, as you've been saying, is emulation, is searching or desiring a higher good. Is that right?
Yeah. Or you can also use a negative term, detachment.
Yes.
I mean, detachment from all those, if you avoid making those things primary, which cannot be shared, you you are on a good road. I mean, it just comes to my mind, one of the traditional Muslim sayings is, wish for yourself what you can also wish for your brother. So that means put at the center of your desire things that you can share. And if you do that, we would be on a better road, on a better way. But it's difficult. I mean, we forget it too often.
Yes, absolutely. So this move to mimetic desire is described in Deceit, Desire, and the novel. And as we conclude this section of our conversations, what Girard says that he got this from the great novelists. What makes a novelist great? And what are there particular novels that you would suggest in order to understand mimetic theory?
I mean, this is a difficult question because even some of the critiques of René Girard said, well, he's not really into literature. He's only into literature as long as it confirms his own theory. And partly that's true, but on the other hand, you can say great literature is written by those writers who understood our entanglements, our strange relations, how they develop and so on. So the great writers become in some way great writers because they are read over centuries, or their plays are performed over centuries. So, I mean, why do we know that Shakespeare is a great writer of tragedies and comedies? Because even today, most of the theaters will play at least once in a year one of his famous plays, right? And why are they played? Because when people watch those plays, they understand it, and it helps them to understand their own life better. Yeah. So I think that's the easiest answer to your question. And my recommendation would be, start reading those 5 novelists that are covered in Girard's Deceit, Desire, and the novel: Cervantes, Flaubert, Stendhal, Dostoevsky, and Proust. And today later he said he would add to that Virginia Woolf, and we could add Jane Austen, and we could add a lot more, of course, today. And for me, one of the examples of a great writer was a discovery I made when I was writing the book, when I was reading Goethe's autobiography. And on a first look, Goethe is not a very from a later perspective. Goethe was very calm, very relaxed. He was the adored writer in Germany and beyond Germany. And once he said he cannot understand how a person can be envious, because envy is such a base emotion. It's not up to real human being. But first of all, the one of his early novels, the what is the sorrows of the young Werther? Is it the sufferings of the young Werther? It's a novel that I think is based on his own experiences as a young man. And this young man is caught up in a triangle relationship. He falls in love with a married woman and even kills himself later on, caused at that time a huge mimetic crisis because many young men killed themselves after reading that novel. But in his much later autobiography, he made a very interesting insight. And I think this is the insight only a great writer can make, because he describes a little bit what he experienced when he was young, and that led to this early novel. He said, I was very attracted to a woman, and one of my closest friends, I said to him, I have to introduce you to this woman. And his friend was not at all convinced, and he said, I do not understand how you can fall in love with this woman. She was not very beautiful, she's married, everything speaks against her. And Goethe writes, it's dangerous if your friend falls in love with the woman you like. But then he continues and says, but it's also dangerous if he dislikes what you adore. Because if your best friend does not imitate your desire for this woman, that diminishes and questions your own desire, and you are no longer sure, is the woman I desire a woman worth to be desired? And I mean, he summarizes that in one sentence or in two sentences. This is a deep insight, and we all know that experience. We all know this experience. And writers who can describe these bizarre and strange experiences we all have throughout our life, I think those are the great writers. And those who make it easy and don't go into that level, they might be nice writers, but are not great novelists or great poets or playwrights.
I had a similar experience recently when I went to, there have been all of these Black Lives Matter protests here in the States. And I went to one of the protests, and I had what I thought was an awesome progressive t-shirt on. And I was going to this progressive protest, and I was like, oh man, people are going to say this is so awesome. Everybody ignored it. Like, is as if I wasn't wearing it, like this t-shirt at all. And I was like, maybe this t-shirt isn't as cool as I thought it was.
Yeah, right. that's a very similar experience.
Yeah. So it's from like love interest to the clothing we wear. We all want affirmation back of our own coolness, or our what we think is our coolness or greatness or whatever. So
yeah, we always, I think that's also important insight of mimetic theory. We are not sure if the objects and goals that we desire are really good objects. So as soon, and I observed it with myself, as soon as we buy a new phone or a new computer or a new car, we try to convince all our friends that this is the best choice you can make, in order that they imitate us and confirm our own choice that we are not absolutely happy. And as soon as some friend said, you are an idiot, we already despise our own choice. So this is a thing, and it relates also to religion, because there are religious people who are very eager to convince everyone their approach of what they think is most important. And this is not so much this is not so much a proof of their strengths in faith. It's the other way around. They are not really sure, so they try to they try to get as much followers for their own beliefs in order to be convinced that this is true. And so it's a very interesting insight if you understand that a certain kind of missionary attitude is still a result of a lack of a calm, faithful rootedness. Let's call it that way.
Reminds me of Shakespeare's great quote when he says, "Methinks the lady doth protest too much."
Mhm.
The more aggressive we are in trying to get people to come on our side for religion, the more likely it is, as you say, we're just trying to convince ourselves of its own importance. So
Mhm. Mhm.
great stuff. So thank you, Wolfgang, for this session on Mimetic Theory 101, and our next session will be the scapegoat mechanism and the origins of culture. So everybody stay tuned for that.